Welcome back. It's No Apologies, and we've got Jared Hendricks, who is the sponsoring committee chairman for an initiated measure on term limits. Welcome, Jared.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you've been here before.
I have.
It's amazing we're having you back.
Yeah, I know.
Wow.
Took a wrong turn. You know.
Yeah. All right. So give us the lowdown. Tell our viewers about this thing that they're likely to see on the ballot when?
2022, likely in June.
June.
Yeah, right now it's officially waiting approval from the Secretary of State. But what this is it's a constitutional ballot measure, like you said. And what it would do is it would apply 2 4-year term limits, 8 years total, to the North Dakota House, the North Dakota Senate, and the governor. North Dakota is one of only 14 states that doesn't have any gubernatorial term limits, so it's actually kind of an outlier on that.
Oh, I did not realize that.
It's a very powerful position. There's only about 15 states that have state legislative term limits. That's a little bit of a different issue, but we're modeling it on essentially George Washington, our first president. I mean, this is a guy who could have been king. He term limited himself to 8 years. And so we're modeling it on that because we believe that that is a good way to have representative government.
Nice. Yep. I know it's something that people have been talking about. Certainly some of my constituents, many of my constituents have been talking about it periodically, but with increasing level of interest, it seems, over these past few years.
Yeah, absolutely. The political winds have shifted in favor of term limits nationally. I mean, the polling data shows that quite clearly. Also, the support in North Dakota is quite clear. I mean, the support is overwhelming for this, and we'll have some information we'll be putting out about that soon. But yeah, I think there's a growing sense of frustration, probably more so directed at Washington than Bismarck, but there's some of both to go around. Mm-hmm. And people want systemic reforms. They want bold systemic reforms that will really start to realign the political power. And that's the way I say that this is going to take the power away from the political class and give it to the citizens.
Sure. The aspect of, we have it when it's going to be on the ballot June or November of 2022. And then presumably it would be effective starting 2023?
It would be effective in January 1st of that following year.
And so in other words, it does not apply to any of the time that the governor or the legislators have already been in office.
Correct. Yeah, it applies to what we call future terms. So in other words, like in my district, one of my 2 House members, he would be able to run again in 2024 because it's an even number district, so it's the presidential cycle. He would then be able to run again in 2028, and then he could technically, if he wanted to, switch to the Senate and do 8 years in the Senate. And even for the future service, because you could do service in the House and in the Senate in the same district, somebody could do 16 years total in the legislature, and then if they were elected governor, they could do a total of 24 years of service. So I think 24 years is a long time in politics and in government. So it's not as restrictive as some would say, but it does put in place structural limits. You know, this is a limit on the government ultimately. It's not a limit on the people. It gives the people more power.
Yeah. So not to get too deep in the weeds, but so for the odd number districts that are going to be up now, and they're going to be at a 4-year term, so their current term will end 2 years after the new change. So will those two years count towards the 8, or does the 8 count at their next election?
It would be the next election.
That would be, okay. Gotcha.
Super confusing. I kind of lost you there on the 8.
Yeah.
So,
but I do like, one of the things that when I was interviewed, we were talking about the pros and cons of the measure, and one of the, I think, interesting discussion points on this measure is whether to have made it retroactive or only, I guess, moving forward, proactive.
Sure. And
because that would mean, for instance, if it was retroactive and passed in 2022, Governor Burgum would not be able to run again. Mm-hmm. The several legislators who have put in more than 8 years or more would also not be able to run again. And the discussion really is about the pros and cons of that. My preference was to go retroactive because it's sort of like, what's good for the goose, good for the gander. Would that term limit me out? Yes, it would. But if that's a good idea, then I think that's fine. But I think, Jared, when you and I were having this discussion some time back, there's also a pro to having it moving forward, in which it's a clean slate. This is not punishing
All
anyone,
even.
specifically Burgum.
Yep.
It's just like everyone knows fresh going in. And so did you have further discussions, or was there any other pushback on one way better than another?
Not a whole lot, actually, but I mean, to your point, though, it's a fair point. If we're saying this is good policy, why not have a good policy right now, or as soon as possible? But there is a certain politics to it, and we are very careful about making sure this is not about any particular person or any set of candidates. And so to that point, if we had made it, quote unquote, about the governor, or if it was perceived that way, not only would you mobilize a certain faction of support against you, but then you really kind of detract from the issue, which is the principle of term limits.
Right.
We don't want to make this this is not about any particular
It's
person.
about
I mean,
limiting government.
Yes. There's plenty of good legislators. I mean, folks like yourself that have been in there for a while, and others that have been in there for a lot longer. So this isn't about any particular person. This is a long-term structural change that will limit the power of the political class, the lobbyists, the bureaucrats, and realign that power back to the people.
Do you have any statistics or information from other states that have implemented this? Like you say, we're kind of late to the game for the governor, but we're ahead of the game apparently with other states with the legislators.
Yeah, there is a lot of data on bureaucracy, and you could look at certainly, Rick, you've talked a lot about comparing to South Dakota when it comes to the budget. And there are certain aspects about South Dakota's term limits that maybe aren't perfect. I mean, I don't want to get too far off into the weeds, but in general, I would say that there's a pretty good argument, and we see this in states without term limits, that you get these long-time relationships between legislators and lobbyists and bureaucrats. And those relationships, because ultimately influence in government comes from relationships, so it's not that all those relationships are bad, but when they are bad, they can be very bad, and I would say more often than not, it's not a good thing for the people or the constituents.
Excellent. All right, folks, we're going to be back. Another segment with Jared. We're going to press him for some of the pros and cons, the arguments maybe against this. So stick with us. We will be right back. Welcome back to No Apologies, where we are unafraid to speak the truth. No, segment 3 is where I say, your after-hours oasis of sanity.
That's right.
I told you I need air conditioning to sleep well.
I feel really bad for you. That must be just awful.
Thank you.
I do. You have all of my empathy.
Thank you so much.
And pity.
We are here with Jared Hendricks, who's talking about term limits. And we are just going to get into the thick of it, the good part, where we're going to challenge you because there are some arguments against it. Okay?
You originally, if I recall, when we ever talked about term limits, said, well, that's what your vote does.
I've wavered. Originally,
I used to be against them too.
Yeah, originally I was for them, and then I was more against them.
Right.
And I'm a little bit on the fence. I'm in favor of them for the governor, which is really what got me, because I am one of the signers, by the way, and I'll full transparency. On the sponsoring committee, I'm one of the committee members. And really what pulled me on board is the aspect that the governor is being term limited. I think that's proper. I'm a little bit on the fence for legislators. However, when you can cross chambers, be in say the House of Representatives for 8 years and then move to the Senate for 8 years.
That's 16 years.
That mitigates my concerns. So this will be my first question for you, Jared. One of the big things I think is one of the best reasons to be against term limits is if you believe that there's not going to be the institutional knowledge gained, meaning legislators aren't there long enough to become adept at all the nuances that they need to know to be effective and to get good legislation through. And if they don't have it, that means they have to rely on bureaucrats and capital lawyers. So what do you say to that argument? Yeah,
well, there is institutional knowledge, but sometimes that becomes institutional inertia where they're resistant to change. And I'm sure you've seen this as a legislator when you get there, and sometimes and I've literally heard these words before of, well, that's not how we do things here. And when you suggest things that maybe are out of the box or maybe a different way of doing things, sometimes you reach roadblocks. So yes, some experience is good. Of course, having knowledge how to run a committee, how to do those things is important. Having a nuanced understanding of an issue that's had multiple legislative aspects over a period of decades. I mean, yes, there's a lot of value in that knowledge, but the question is always the trade-off. How much damage can come from that relationship? Again, we go back to the power and influence in politics largely comes from relationships. So how much harm can come from that situation where you have a career politician, a longtime legislator that has that institutional knowledge, which with an agency official and a lobbyist that may not be in the best interest of the taxpayers or their constituents. So it's really a trade-off, and I think in the net, there is much more to gain from changing and having new blood.
Yeah. And again, I agree. That's why I'm on. 8 years, if it was a flat 8 years, I don't think is enough.
Sure.
But because you can continue to gain knowledge, cross the chamber, and become a leader in the whatever chamber you're going to move to, I think that takes care of that somewhat.
And another minor point to that there's nothing that prohibits someone, if someone really wants to serve their community, which is great, we need people, and I think we've got great people here who can do that, but you don't have to be a senator for 40 years. You can be a county commissioner, you can be in your school board. There's those are really, I would say, where there's much greater need in a lot of those positions.
That's true. I mean, that's a great point. I have
That's
not
an
heard someone
excellent
say that
point.
before.
I hadn't even thought of that.
That's
That's exactly right. And you can serve your community, and in those ways, that's where we need people too.
Yeah, if it's really about service and not some other reason, then it shouldn't be a problem.
Yep.
It's a great point.
Okay, let me ask you another one I've heard. This is just going to help Democrats.
I don't think being a Republican chairman, I personally wouldn't be supporting it if I felt that way. So I don't think that's a good argument. I think it's kind of a cop-out in a way. It kind of says that we don't have much confidence in ourselves as a party, that we can't find good candidates. And you and I talked about this last time I was on, but there's been a lot of interest and activity, these reorganization meetings at the Republican Party level for the last few months. There are thousands of new people that are engaged. So I think that there's a huge bench out there and a perfect ability to find candidates all over the state. I'm not worried about that.
What do you say about people who argue that there's going to be a lot more out-of-state money involved?
Well, out-of-state money is a legitimate issue. I think it's something, and Rick, you and I have talked about this, I think it's something that we can look at. For our organization, what we decided to do is we decided to go to those that we believe have the most expertise to help us. And there is a group called U.S. Term Limits, which is a 501c4. They are solely focused on this issue of term limits, both at state level and federal. That has been what they've been doing for about 35 years. So we went to them and sought their assistance, financial, their guidance, and otherwise. But all the decisions are being made by North Dakotans. I mean, this is a North Dakota initiative, but I mean, the issue of money in politics is a separate but perfectly valid issue.
Yeah, I think that just the term out-of-state money, it can immediately set people to feeling one way or the other. But I think you can have out-of-state money that is used to completely influence and change the perception of the North Dakota voter. Sure. To get something passed that's a pet project. Term limits is something that's all across the nation. We have strong interest. If you have an organization that says, "Hey, we'd like to pass this," naturally you're going to go to people that have the expertise.
Right.
And if they happen to be out of state, they're out of state.
It's just like when you worked on your constitutional carry bill for the Second Amendment.
Yep.
You spoke with the NRA, not because you want to kowtow to an out-of-state interest, but because the NRA is the foremost authority on defending gun rights in the United States.
Yep, that's a good point. Very good point. Montana. Now, I don't know a lot about Montana's law. South Dakota also has term limits for legislators. Montana does as well. I've heard a couple of people say, "Oh, Montana is just a mess, and we don't want to be like Montana." Now, they didn't expound beyond that. I don't know what they meant. I should have maybe asked, are you aware of concerns with our neighboring states, South Dakota and Montana, that you would see those same concerns applicable to your measure?
Not any concerns that outweigh the benefits. And the other thing I would say is that I would imagine the people you've heard that from are probably people in political circles, probably legislators, I would assume. So, of course, again, it goes back to the political class is not going to support this. Of course they're not. And I have many friends, some of whom probably aren't very happy with right now because I'm supporting this, and that's fine. I accepted that when I sign on to it. If I believe something's right, I'm going to do it regardless of that. But But yes, people in the political class will find every reason to find every little nuance that could be wrong with this, that this isn't going to work because of this or because of that. And at the end of the day, it just comes down to its term limits. If we have problems with bureaucracy, well, why do we keep giving a blank check to the governor? I mean, if we have problems with the growth of government and the bureaucracy having too much power, that still comes down to the people that are in there. Whether you're in there for 1 term or 6 terms, the issue is still the same. We have to elect good people that will stand up to that.
It seems like limiting the term limits to not such a very short period of time, it was very prudent on your part too when you did that. You didn't say, okay, you're only 2 terms and then you can't go into the Senate. You're doubling that.
Sure.
So when you did your research, did you find that there are even longer periods of time that some states did, or?
Yeah, there's some variation. I don't have all of it in front of me right now, but there is some variation to how some states do it, and some of them have rules about whether it's consecutive or not.
Sure.
That's especially true on the governor, actually. Like in the case of Virginia, state of Virginia has the strictest term limits in the country for governor. You can only have 1 consecutive term.
Wow.
So it does depend on the state.
Interesting. Very, very good.
Well, and when are we going to see people getting signatures?
Well, right now it's pending approval with the Secretary of State's office,
Okay.
which is probably maybe within the week here. We're hoping to find out. It'll get approved for circulation, and then we have to get 36,000 signatures, and hopefully it'll be on the ballot likely in June of 2022.
Gotcha. All right.
Thank you so
Well,
much for the
thanks,
update
Jared.
and the information.
There you
Very
have
good
it,
stuff.
folks.
Thanks for having me on.
Term limits measure coming up June of 22.
Okay, we're going to do something really cool and different.
Yes.
We're going to do an on location, and you'll be able to see us on location in our clip next. Stay with us.